There you go. So this is part of a broader project on trying to understand different kinds of motivations behind mobility, migration, and immobility as well, as Anne mentioned. This is a little bit more conceptual. A lot of my work is empirical, of course, especially the last few years on environmental migration, particularly between Mexico and the United States, a little bit within Mexico. But this is again a broader project that I've been working on since my first sabbatical, so many years, trying to think about different ways to conceptualize migration and its drivers. So I appreciate the time, the feedback you may have on this, and basically I can talk a little bit more about the broader project in the Q&A. So there you go. So of course today, I guess more than ever, or just as always, it's very important to understand what drives migration, particularly international migration, given its I would say renewed attention, right, and focus and dynamic sentiment, right? Current today in many parts of the world, certainly in the United States, for example, where migration in general has become a much more contested topic even than 10, 20 years ago, right? When it was already a contested topic. At the same time, we know, of course, that migration motivations are heterogeneous, right? And different kinds of motivations could overlap or be interrelated within individuals, right? So we could have, we contain multitudes, so we may have, competing or commingled or, mutually reinforcing motivations to move or not. As well as, within families or other collectives, right? There would be this same idea where, members of one family might be pushing in one direction, members of the family may be pushing in a different direction, and so on. And that may, of course, affect who migrates out of that family as well, or whether the family migrates in general, as well as at the population level, right? And I'll try to get into this a little more in a moment. But this we know, and there's only many consideration of this. And by motivations, I not only mean the things that we recognize as such, right, ourselves. I use the term a little more loosely as it's done often in the literature, in terms of also the forces that drive our motivations, right, or our behavior, right? Whether we recognize it as such or not, right? So it's a little bit, I'm playing a little bit fast and loose with this, but for good reason, I think, because we do want to include, these broader forces, right, that might be moving us in a particular direction without us quite articulating them very well. Of course, scholarship, recognizes this, that migration or immobility, right, as much smaller work, but emerging and important pieces of work on immobility can be the result of various mixed motivations, and again, an individual, group of some level, or population levels. However, a lot of this work has been kind of channeled into silos, right? Like forced migration studies, environmental migration, climate migration, types of literature where I work in, for example, as well. Lifestyle migrations, right? Which folks especially in England, have worked on, and among other places. But there's a big group, or there was a big group in England, like Karen O'Reilly and others. And these efforts to conceptualize how these various motivations overlap or are interrelated, or how do we, think about it at a broader, like more integrated level of not only this one particular type of move, like force, like family, environmental, lifestyle, have been more scarce, right? And less explicit, less systematic. Particularly, again, including immobility. So this is a problem I argue in a paper that I published in IMR last year, in which, because overlap, interrelation, understanding, right, these motivations properly and how are they mixed or not, how these sometimes hidden motivations to not move also play a role, can lead to, potentially us misunderstanding what exactly drives people, right, to move. More specifically, or not to move, right? So to give you an example, a lot of the work We think that labor migration, for good reason, labor migration is likely the most important reason why people move. At the same time, there are many reasons why people move that have some economic, underpinnings of some. I mean, most of us have to work to live, right? And therefore, it may appear to the naked eye, right, with a particular analytical focus, with particular data set, like we are moving for work, when we are not moving for work, we're moving for other reasons, right? So this is recognized in the literature again, but it's not as conceptualized in a broader sense. So the goal of my project, or this particular part of the project, has been to provide a broader systematic taxonomy of migration and immobility motivations. More generally, first by basically describing this spectrum of immobility and mobility motivations, organizing them around the degree to which they are driven by different kinds of extrinsic and intrinsic rewards and costs. That seems to be the most basic way to organize them, a way that appeals to some literature on economics, psychology, philosophy as well, to some extent, or some kinds of philosophy, I guess. Which I'll describe. Then I'll provide a more general typology of the possible ways in which immobility and mobility motivations can overlap or be interrelated or not, right? At both individual and population levels, and I'll try to include these aggregates in different ways. And aggregates meaning especially families, but it could be other groupings. Again, like clan or township and so on. But families are the most important by far, and they're defined in different ways across the world, of course, as the families, the demographers in the room may of course know much more than I do. And then the third part, very briefly, I will basically just kind of walk you a little bit through two, maybe three, if we have time, probably not, ways in which these different motivations could overlap and can overlap or interrelate in the context of three different theories that relate to decision-making migration. In micro-decision, that model micro-decision more specifically or much more explicitly, right? The first one being very important here in Europe, especially in sociology, I guess I would say, as the aspirations capabilities framework. Then the so-called neoclassical economics, which is a more standard human capital model used in economics, as well as the an offshoot of this human capital model known as the new economics of labor migration. All right. So first on types of motivations. So if one looks at the literature, these are the main ones, right? These six are the main motivations that are discussed in the literature. There might be others. And in fact, I'm kind of grabbing this self-fulfillment, creating it from not really creating it, but I'm basically these packages, different kinds of moves related to self-realization, sometimes called lifestyle migration, digital nomadism, right? Very much in vogue these days. If you have any connections to or with places like Portugal, Mexico City, right? Maybe Vienna now is a digital nomad place. I'm about to find out. I just landed today, so I have not encountered any digital nomads yet. But it's very clear, right, that many parts of the world, especially driven by the lockdowns of the pandemic, right? It exploded in some parts of the world at least, and that all relates to self-fulfillment to some degree, right? So this on the top right of the corner of the screen, of course, economic migrations being very, very important, including labor-related migrations, which are a type of economic migration, right, related to financial gain and security. But which, as you see, what I'm trying to depict here in the picture is that not all labor-related migrations are only economic or mainly economic even, right? So digital nomadism being a good example of that, right? So people move not for work, but actually for other reasons. But it's a labor migration as well in some fashion because it basically is related to working to some degree, right? In some cases, in others, a little less so, but or retirement migration is also one of those self-fulfillment ones. You see environmental migration at the center, and sometimes depending on the type, especially for rapid onset events, it tends to be safety related, right? In other cases, it's much less so, like slower onset events, like the types of work I study, like the types of events I study in Mexico, right? Like drought, for example, it tends to be more related to economic loss, right? Or anticipating economic loss or reacting to economic loss. And therefore, it's a little bit labor related as well, or somewhat labor related. It's certainly economic related as well, right? Even safety related moves, right? So people moving to seek refuge, to avoid displaced by violence. They're not only related to safety, they're also related to economic conditions, right? Which explains why some people may be able to move, especially to a particular place or a particular continent or internationally or more longer distance and so on, while others don't. Family, of course, also plays a big role in many of these moves by directing them, for example, right? Oftentimes, people move where they have relatives or other connections, but family I use that family term, but in the paper, I loosely also refer to other types of social relations, right? Not only family, loved ones or whatnot. Other types of networks, I suppose, or institutions, but especially family, right? And these 6 motivations, again, they could, of course, overlap, but I organize them according to, again, in this literature that sort of is between psychology and philosophy, which I didn't know that there was such a thing, but apparently there's scholars that work on, basically, they're more like philosophers, but work on the psychological types of things like this. They're organized around the idea that whether people, we move or not, right? These are both related to mobility or immobility, right? So given that we want or pursue things that will bring us more extrinsic reward, more intrinsic rewards, right? Which are defined by extrinsic reward is material, right? Tends to be quite material in terms of its gains or in terms of its costs as well, right? The losses. Whereas intrinsic, it relates more to how it affects ourselves. The line between them, of course, is very gray. It's vague. It's socially constructed, right? So a lot of different kinds of social control, for example, will relate to implicit or intrinsic, rewards or costs, right? But eventually, some of them, for example, persecution due to sexuality, right, could become extrinsic, right, in the sense that it could relate to one's safety. So people fleeing, for example, there's studies in which people document how people have fled different parts of East Africa due to persecution due to sexuality, to the point of basically having a material cost, right? Having being threatened in terms of their lives. That basically brings it's much less about intrinsic cost and it's a little bit more about extrinsic cost. So it becomes basically safety related. Whereas I don't know, the work of Héctor Carrillo in Mexico. I mean, there's of course violence against LGBTQ folks in Mexico as well, but that particular work, right, suggests that actually a lot of folks that migrated internationally, they are fleeing some types of more intrinsic costs than extrinsic costs, right? So they're not fleeing violence per se, but they're fleeing familial social pressures or lack of sanctions, right, or social disapproval, or they might be, just moving for self-fulfillment to other places where, to like-minded communities, for example, right, as well. So that's the idea behind these 4 poles, right? And again, this could lead to mobility, or it could lead to immobility, right? And I'm using this. A lot of the immobility work has been done in the context of the so-called aspirations capabilities framework, advanced many years ago by Jürgen Karling with his work in Cape Verde, and since then developed by others, including especially Carolyn Shevel, who heard in 2019, 2020, depending on when you downloaded the paper from the IMR site, whether you downloaded the first online or the other paper, basically suggests it's a really great paper. I certainly recommend that you read if you're further interested in this, or you probably have read it already if you are interested in this, where she basically talks about this continuum, right, between the capabilities, having capabilities to migrate or not, right, will lead you to be able to move or not, right? So for people who are on the left of this axis, of the y-axis, and I don't make them orthogonal because this work, the work of Shevel, the work of Carlin, the work of Hein de Haas, suggests that actually a lot of this is related. Basically, if you don't have the capabilities to migrate, that defines your aspirations quite a bit, right? So they are not usually, they're not exogenous to each other. And having no capabilities, right, being on the left-hand side of this axis would lead to immobility, right? But it would lead to involuntary immobility or acquiescent immobility. Involuntary immobility for those who have no capabilities but want to migrate, and acquiescent immobility for those who don't want to migrate and can't migrate, right? They simply are not very aware that they, these opportunities, and they don't care about them. This concept is a little underdeveloped, but we can talk more about it later on as well. Now, in addition to that, people that do have capabilities but don't move, right, because they don't have desires to move, they are considered voluntarily immobile. Voluntarily immobile, right here. As well as some folks might be, this is involuntary mobile, who are people who are also able to migrate but don't want to migrate, but they do, right? So the difference between these two is the mobility part, right? Where these folks tend to be the displaced, and these folks tend to be the people that are just fine in their communities, that everything is okay, and they don't, right? And of course, the other end of the spectrum is the people that actually move voluntarily. So I introduced this again to just remind us of the idea of immobility and how it can also lead to an outcome. So if you think about this in the context of, your own lives or your own work, the people you study or the context you study, you'll see, right, that all of a sudden for example, environmental migration, in my work, for example, I think, okay, so people are not only, of course, considering the environment, they're considering labor opportunities, other types of economic incentives, family, of course, plays a role, and these roles are not always, again, related to whether people want to move or not, but also when people don't want to move, right? So this decision is, in a way, a weighted average of sorts, potentially, of all of these forces playing, not only the typical push-pull approach, right, which is, again, just a metaphor, right? This is not how things work in our heads necessarily, but it's a metaphor. And Schlegel expands that metaphor to calling it push-pull, repel, retain, right? Which is, I think, again, quite useful to just sort of think mechanically of this. All right. So we set up the general idea. Now let's go to, okay, so how could these motivations, right, overlap, interrelate, these different ones, overlap, interrelate, and so on. So I propose these three different ways, and let me walk you through them just briefly. The most typical one is when people, or different populations or subpopulations, subgroups within a population, a national population, for example, have different motivations, right? X1 could be myself, X2 could be Anne, right? And we both have different reasons why we want to move or not, right? So at the population level, once we aggregate everybody's kinds of motivations, we come up with basically two or three or X or K typologies, right? People depending on their motivations. It could be that some people are, economic migrants, more purely economic migrants, or even purely economic migrants, and some people are forced migrants, right, out of the same place. Or digital nomads, right? For example, like urban, middle class, better educated folks are maybe digital nomads, right? X1, and X2 maybe rural landholders might be more, motivated by the types of things that the new economics of labor migration would suggest, right? So we have those two types. Of course, the X1 and X2 may not necessarily be pure types. They could be, clicking on the wrong computer again. They could be mixed motivations, right? And those mixed motivations, so if you think of One of these, right, being the product of either of these. I'm sorry, I used X again because actually you could think that basically this is producing X1 and this is producing X2, right, here. So you could think of different combinations of things in sending areas and destinations, for example, combining in a way that produces a particular type of mobility. For example, policies, right, immigration enforcement policies in destinations and better economic opportunities in sending areas like where I'm from, central western Mexico, right? There's some documented work, some work documenting that there was a decline in Mexico-US migration around 15, 20 years ago that was ushered in by the global financial crisis that was precipitated by the US housing bust, right, in the United States. But so I guess this would be a C3. But was basically met with these long-term trends in lower fertility in Mexico, having a demographic impact, right, lowering the size of the incoming labor force, which created and then more economic and educational opportunities from regional university campuses, for example, being open before that. The tequila industry, right, being considerably booming at the time, well, still booming, I guess. More or less, right? Creating less desire by youth, right, to move out, right, of the country, like the work of what's his name, Matthew. I'm sure I'll remember later. I'm sorry, but these two combined, right, to produce basically a type of immobility in this case, or lower mobility, right? That again, would look like this for those folks in that region, right? Potentially. But it could also produce a combination individually as well. At other aggregation levels. So for example, members of a family might basically, now the parents might continue to migrate despite these changes because of other changes, right? Or the combination of other changes. For example, sometimes these factors have more of a full-on interaction, and the classical case in my view is that of immigration from the so-called Pale settlement of ethnic Jews from the Pale settlement at the late 19th century in present-day Ukraine and Belarus, especially. Right, and how Leah Bustan, for example, shows in her work that these folks, while migrations or out-migrations were followed pogrom violence, where people displaced by the violence, they also followed a very similar ebb and flow to other migrants from other parts of the world to the US. And I think studies also show the same for the east side of London, for example, of these folks. So it has some economic underpinnings as well, right? So it was related to economic opportunities in some fashion. So the combination of these two types of factors, one in sending areas, one in destinations, but combined, right, in this case, not only like acting in tandem, so to speak, acting semi-independently, but acting in tandem, created more of these mixed motivations, right, to move, and certainly the ebb and flow of migration. The last possibility, which is not the most common one at all, but that's an interesting one, I think, is when actually conditions are completely negatively related to each other. The typical example is how labor migration flows or systems can be disrupted by violence, right? And other types of perturbances or shocks, but violence is the most important one by far, I think. So think of a case of basically typically people that would otherwise be labor migrants, all of a sudden being not able to migrate and being actually trapped in place due to war, right? As opposed to being displaced. Some people may be displaced as well due to the war, but just think of young people in military age, right? All of a sudden being conscripted or not being allowed to leave the country so easily, right? So all of a sudden there's basically complete full negative correlation almost between the motivations, right? So what motivated people to move for labor mainly now becomes a hindrance, right? Or these people, right? The new conditions create basically the complete opposite or a very different motivation to move as well, right? So it could be that younger people, younger kids, older adults are moving, displaced as well at the same time. So which makes it complicated again because these three possibilities could all occur, could co-occur, right, at the same time. All right, so I hope that that gives us a sense of these different kinds of overlap and interrelation. And just to give us a couple more examples, how long do you normally leave for Q&A?
20 minutes is fine, so if you have 10 minutes
okay,
more,
so I
like...
Yep, okay. So let me give you a couple of examples based on these micro decision-making theories. And certainly I'll talk about it, aspirations capabilities, given that I already introduced it. But in this case, right, so my argument in the paper is that these different forms of voluntary mobility, involuntary mobility could be better understood, and the work in this field recognizes the overlap, I should say, and tries to do to add a little bit, but the way in which I integrate these 6 different motivations as opposed to 1 or 2 that may be more prevalent in a particular place, I hope gives us some idea of how they could bring not only more texture, right, to this, of course, complicate the issue, which has empirical implications which are difficult to deal with. I recognize that, but I hope that it also opens up possibilities, right, to better explain and actually to increase the predictive power of models, for example, as well, right, if you consider other possibilities. So in this case, for example, just as I mentioned before, we consider, right, that voluntary immobility may be most common in a particular place, but for whom, versus involuntary mobility, right? It could be related again to these different kinds of pull, push, pull, repel, retain factors of the different biology, right, that relate to these different extrinsic, intrinsic costs and benefits. Yeah, so let me move on from this one, but because I think I addressed it before, but I'm happy to go back to the Q&A. And let me introduce this. This is the human capital model. Sorry for this small font, but this is basically the typical model that you may remember from, I don't know, pieces like Massey and colleagues, this Worlds in Motion, or their PDR paper, which has way more citations. The classical, right, where for many labor / development economists, right, these models were developed in both. The decision to move, or the expected value of moving, right, here is the result of the cost-benefit calculation of the benefits of moving minus the cost of moving, of course. So the benefits of moving, the benefits of moving being here at this y dj, the destination j, so it could be more than one destination at time t, right? And this is the and then the costs of moving are here in this C term, which I develop further here, right? Which is basically, you know, just your typical costs of moving. A lot of them are explicit, or I'm sorry, extrinsic, right? So the smuggling costs and whatnot. Some are not, right? So in fact, a lot of the intrinsic costs, well, there are intrinsic costs of moving too, especially if you hold licenses a degree or something, right? Like the occupational downgrading, or the simple fact that people don't necessarily want to move to a new place because they use social status or connections, which then has affects their well-being in different ways, and certainly their social status. In addition to those, there's also the opportunity cost of moving, right? So if you don't move, you could be making this much money, or being employed more and more often, or have other benefits, right? But also if you don't move, you could face certain costs, right? Which again, they differ for different people according to our social categories, our family position, gender, sexuality, race, religion, ethnicity, different things that, social categories, but also other circumstances that may not necessarily fall into these more typical social categories that are quite important in life in many places, right? So, and this is all weighted by different kinds of things, including preferences for a particular location, right? So we value benefits of moving or not, and the cost of moving or not, extrinsic or intrinsic, depending on our preferences, right? On what we want, where we want to live and why, right? Which in many of these work have been considered to be exogenous and they are not changing, even worse. But nowadays, I think a lot of the work, I'm basically summarizing a lot of the work that economists have done, and this is not my model at all. I just kind of grabbed a couple of different models from Van Dort, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name somehow, and others, to basically include this, right? But there's some people are trying to relax these assumptions. But point being that a lot of the things that we discussed already, that I discussed already, can be added to this model, right? So it's very flexible. The problem is how to do them empirically, right? And the other problem, by the way, is that this model assumes that a lot of these decisions are ex ante, right? So this is the present value between your hx and some future time, maybe by the time you think you're gonna die, right? X plus E of X, as demographers like this, right? And these are weighted down by this discount rate, right? So whether we care a lot about the future or not, or I just care about the present, is also a preference, a time preference in this case, which is also, kind of ambiguous in terms of how we come up with these preferences, right? But they matter a lot. Less than locational preferences, I think, but matter a lot. And of course, they are all subject to budget constraints. So again, all of these enter in the paper. I discuss a little bit more, or a little bit. I don't think I do like a ton of this in the space I could use for this, in terms of how these different motivations, right, may play and could be integrated into the same model, right? More specifically, in this model, has been explained in a couple of different ways. And for those of you who may be familiar with this new economics of labor migration, basically the new economics of labor migration is a model of cost-benefit, rational decision-making like this one, except that my decision is not only mine, or it's not only the family, migration per se is not only driven by one particular person, but it's related to the decisions of a collective, right? So you could think of various chain, equations that are sort of related to each other of these, right? With different weights or different differentials in power, right, between people, and they could be. I mean, a lot of this work is not necessarily, mathematically explained like this, but some of it is, like some of the work by Yin Yang or by Christian Dustman, of course, kind of borderlines on this type of model, in which, again, the decision of more than one member of the collective, right, is they're changing some way. So that's an improvement of the model, right? Because we do know that many people don't make decisions on their own. They're part of a collective, and that collective ends up influencing whether they move, but also whether they don't move, right? Because of other people moving, right? Because oftentimes in Mexico-US case especially, but others as well, it was only one member of the family who initially migrates before others migrate, or simply they return home and they call it a day, right? So that's one thing. The other two important additions of these kinds of thinking is relative deprivation, right? So that we do not only care about like the benefits and costs of moving in absolute terms, like, oh, I want to make more money. I also care about whether I'm going to be, how well off I'm going to be relative to a reference group, right? And that reference group tends to be local in my sending area, right? So it tends to be, how am I going to keep up with these people, especially, right, in migration, people are migrating and are bringing back or sending back remittances or bringing back resources. That creates additional relative deprivation. And basically it's a cumulative causation, they call it mechanism, right, by which people may want to then increase their move. Not because, again, of the absolute gains, but because of the relative gains or the relative losses, right? So it might be a little more intrinsic in that sense. Although it could also be extrinsic if all of those remittances, all of that moving is increasing land values, is making life more expensive in these townships and so on, in a way that then, you actually have to migrate as well to be able to, maintain your standard of living even, right? So it's not about social status. But it is socially constructed, right? It can be, unless again it's this inflationary spiral, which is not as common in every community that sends a lot of migrants, but it happens in some. That it could be then related to self-fulfillment in that case, right? So my point there is that it's not only economic, motivations, but it also can could relate to self-fulfillment. And the other motivation, it relates to overcoming market failure in sending areas, especially in sending areas. It doesn't need to be sending areas. You just simply live in a place where there are, well, as it generally relates to sending areas, right? That one migrates in order to overcome market failures. For example, lack of credit markets, right? Lack of insurance for crops and so on. So people migrate in order to make up for for that inability to, for example, obtain a loan, right? To build, buy capital equipment or something like that in a rural area. The notion here is that for those folks, there tends to be a strong preference for consumption in the origin communities. That's why they want to basically get this cash and then use it back in the sending area. Which in another paper I argue that that's we could expand the new economics of labor migration beyond that and talk about other types of motivations that relate to market failure without necessarily having a strong preference for consumption or living in origin communities, but it's a very common thing that it does happen. Seems to be pretty common in many settings. And again, these factors go beyond economic extrinsic costs and rewards, right? They relate to other kinds of risk management, right? Including related to environmental variability or climatic variability, right? So these three, right? Just to basically wrap up and see if how this went, I guess, once we go to the Q&A. I think that again, recognizing this heterogeneity in motivations that I have basically tried to open up a little more and provide a little bit more systematic guidance into this taxonomy of how they might, occur. I think it can help us recognize these heterogeneity motivations more, which could improve our understanding of mobility and immobility as well, especially immobility perhaps on several fronts. Right? Not only in terms of how David Mackenzie talks about, maybe we should not focus so much on why do so many people migrate, but why so many more people don't, right, migrate. Also, why, a very important issue, especially in a place like the United States, where immigration enforcement is extreme in these days and certainly not very effective over the century, although it has certainly become more effective than it used to be because it's so draconian these days, but still not 100% effective, right? So understanding why this is not as effective in some settings for some people versus other would be good. And also, of course, to understand why forced migration is not only following, right, the intensity of conflict, right? It's not only related to this, or same for environmental migration to a lesser degree. I also have some additional suggestions or thoughts on the aspirations capabilities framework in particular. That we can chat in the Q&A, but more importantly, I think for this group, I think that recognizing these possibilities should also improve our measurement of migration, its motivations, its mechanisms, either with a particular framework like the aspirations capabilities framework in mind or not. We do want to basically improve our empirical measurement of migration and immobility, right? Both. By asking people for the way in which these various factors motivate them to move versus stay, right? So I don't see a lot of a way around not basically improving our surveys and nor complicating them more, at least in some cases, right? At least not always, but in some cases, at least we could do that, as well as more broadly as operationalizing these forces, potentially producing overlap interrelation with historical comparative, and especially in the European demographic context, very important cross-context research, right? Necessary for some. Where of course there are measurement challenges, right? So how do we understand lifestyle, right, preferences or things like that? But that's the good part about this project. It's more about like bringing problems and not as much as solutions. But I mean, I'm happy to talk about solutions. But I'll stop there and thank you again for your attention.